In the late 13th to early 14th century, a war would unravel that would echo throughout history for generations to come: the First War of Scottish Independence. The roots of the conflict lay in the English invasion of Scotland, beginning in 1296 when King Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, sought to assert English dominance over Scotland. The Scots, however, resisted fiercely, and after the death of the Scottish King Alexander III in 1286, the country had been plunged into turmoil over succession. Edward's interference in Scottish affairs and his imposition of English rule led to a long and brutal struggle for Scottish independence. A large English army of about 20 to 25,000 men was led by King Edward II. His force consisted of English knights, heavy cavalry, infantry, and longbowmen. They marched unopposed into Scottish lands, looking to put an end to the long and costly conflict and subdue Scotland under English control once and for all. The year was 1314 and Scotland was at a crossroads, but under the leadership of Robert the Bruce, the tide had begun to turn. The battle that would define the fate of Scotland began to unravel near a place known as Bannockburn, just south of Stirling, in late June of that year. The English arriving to the battlefield were spotted by Scottish cavalry scouts, and Robert the Bruce, commanding a much smaller army of about 7,000 to 10,000 men, had prepared accordingly for what his men were about to face. Robert the Bruce was also a master of strategy. He knew that his army could not stand against the sheer numbers of the English, so he chose a defensive position. The battlefield was narrow, covered in dense forestry, and flanked by marshes on one side and a stream on the other, limiting the English ability to maneuver. Bruce positioned the bulk of his army in the nearby forest, awaiting patiently for the English to make their move. The Scottish force was primarily composed of infantry, with a corps of skilled spearmen and archers, along with a smaller contingent of cavalry. Bruce's secret weapon lay in his schiltron soldiers. These men were equipped with very long pikes that in unison formed a deadly wall of spikes, making it near impossible for cavalry of any kind to break through their formation. The battle commenced when the Earl of Hereford's nephew, Henry de Bohun, spotted the Scottish king poorly equipped and took advantage. Henry de Bohun charged forward in full combat gear with his lance. Spotting the Scottish king, he charged toward him. When the two passed side by side, Bruce split Bohun's head open with his axe, killing him instantly. Meanwhile, the Earl of Hereford ordered his knights and heavy cavalry to run down the Scottish infantry that were shielding King Robert before they could retreat into the woods. Robert, seeing this, ordered his schiltrons to form up. The Scots had no intention of retreating. Before the battle had begun, Robert had ordered large, spiked pits dug and hidden across both sides of the road in preparation for an English attack. As the English heavy knights approached Robert's position, the Scottish schiltrons lowered their pikes and formed into a tight formation. Hereford's heavy cavalry smashed into the wall of pikes, suffering heavy casualties as a result. Many of the English knights whom tried to ride around the flanks of the Scottish position were chopped down by the spiked traps that had been laid. English cavalry under the command of Gloucester attempted to encircle Robert's position. However, Robert's brother, Edward Bruce, led his contingent of Scottish schiltrons outward from the forest, deterring the English knights and cavalry, sending them retreating. The fighting for the day was far from over. As Robert and his brother held off the English advance from the south, another English force had entered the battlefield from the northeast position. English cavalry led by Robert de Clifford had outmaneuvered the Scottish position. Aware of the threat, Scottish commander Thomas Randolph led his contingents of Shiltron infantry out from the forest to deter the English. Scottish commander James Douglas quickly mobilized his contingents of Shiltron and joined the fighting. Clifford's cavalry encircled their position, charging continuously at the ranks of Scottish pikes. Unable to penetrate the Shiltron, the English cavalry threw whatever projectiles they had at the Scottish without effect. The English were pushed back and forced to retreat. The fighting for the day came to a close. During the night, the English forces crossed the stream known as the Bannockburn, establishing their position on the plain beyond it. A Scottish knight, Alexander Seton, who was fighting in the service of Edward II of England, deserted the English camp and told Bruce that English morale was low and encouraged him to attack. The English, who were ever confident just a day prior, due to their larger army and superior cavalry, were now given a bit of a reality check. They realized the Scottish were not going to be defeated so easily. In the morning, Robert ordered the Scots to advance. King Edward was surprised to see the Scottish pikemen emerge from the cover of the woods onto the open terrain and advance towards his position. Robert sent his archers ahead of the infantry columns in an effort to tie down the English longbowmen, thus protecting his Shiltron pikemen from volleys of English arrows, allowing them to focus all of their attention at dealing with the heavy English cavalry. The Earl of Gloucester had argued with fellow English commanders about whom should lead the vanguard attack on the Scots. After arguing in vain, he then took it upon himself, charging head-on to meet the enemy. The English heavy cavalry and knights rode across the battlefield. A heavy stampede of hooves rang across the field. As they edged closer, the Scottish Shiltron lowered their pikes and braced for impact. The English cavalry smashed into the wall of Scottish pikes, causing immense casualties, including the Earl of Gloucester himself. More and more English cavalry charged headfirst into the meat grinder that was the Scottish pike Shiltron. The Shiltron slowly edged forward, forcing the English cavalry to give ground. Robert's men kept pushing forward, not giving an inch of ground. The English were gradually forced backwards, and their cavalry was ground down by the Scottish schiltrons. Many of the English riders had been dismounted, with many others struck down. It was beginning to turn into a massacre for the English. The English longbowmen attempted to support the advance of the knights, but were ordered to stop shooting to avoid additional friendly fire. The English then attempted to deploy their longbowmen to flank the advancing Scots. However, 500 Scottish cavalry were dispersed under the command of Mareschal Sir Robert Keith. The Scottish cavalry swiftly cut down the English archers, sending them fleeing from the battle. The English cavalry was hemmed in against the Bannockburn, making it difficult for them to maneuver. Unable to hold their formations, they broke rank. It soon became clear to Aymer de Valence and Gilles d'Argentan that the English had lost the battle, and Edward II needed at all costs to be led to safety. Seizing the reins of the king's horse, they dragged him away, closely followed by 500 knights of the royal bodyguard. In the chaos, the English king's command structure collapsed. Edward II's forces were thrown into disarray, and the Scots seized the opportunity to launch a full-scale counterattack. Many English knights and soldiers fled the battlefield, and the rout began in earnest. The Scots pursued, driving the English forces away from the field. The English had suffered heavy losses, with most coming from their retreat, in which many of their infantry, who failed to participate in the battle, drowned in the nearby rivers and swampland upon retreating. The Scottish, on the other hand, had suffered but a few hundred losses, entirely infantry. The Battle of Bannockburn was a decisive victory for Robert the Bruce and his forces. Though Edward II's army had been larger and better equipped, the Scots' superior knowledge of the terrain, disciplined tactics, and fighting spirit led them to a stunning victory. The defeat shattered the morale of the English and left Scotland firmly in the hands of Robert the Bruce and a new independent Scotland.